2. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. The 1947 today, as promised, it's ground that is fairly well trodden, so a lot of you will be familiar with it, and I hope that what I've been able to do is to dredge up some unusual images and also one or two bits of commentary. Sorry, is the volume okay for everybody? Not? Need to turn it up? Can you hear me now? No?
I can get it to work differently. You can work here.
I'm wearing it in exactly the same place as I've worn it before. Is that better? No?
Is it on?
Still got problems?
Just turn it on. I think it's off.
It's not turned on. As the SABC says, we have a temporary technical problem. Okay, thank you very much.
I suggest if the light is turned down a bit, the light so we would get a better view of the images.
Okay. Any other requests? Popcorn? Albatross? Gannet Ripple? Down more? No, that's up. Darker. Darker. Can I get darker than that? There we go. Everybody happy? Okay. Right. Good afternoon. 1947, well-trodden ground. A lot of the images will be familiar to you. I hope that I've managed to source some that are unfamiliar to you, and also some bits and pieces of commentary that I've picked up along the line. So the main event is 1947, the tour of the whole royal family. So what began as an invitation from Field Marshal Smuts to the war-weary King and Queen to spend a holiday in South Africa became a full-blown state visit and royal tour that closely recycled the templates of 1860 and 1925, which we've discussed earlier this week. The King had a high regard for the wartime leadership of Smuts, and he leapt at the opportunity to personally thank South Africans for their military and material support of Great Britain during the war. Smuts wanted South Africa to bask in his reflected glory as a world statesman, boxing in his own class amongst the victors and the leading nations of the world. Moreover, he was not unaware of his unpopularity at home amongst the nationalists and Republicans and those with long memories. So at precisely 9:40 a.m. on Monday the 17th of February, HMS Vanguard moored at Jayberth, escorted by the South African Air Force and the frigates SANF Good Hope, Natal and Transvaal. You remember the escort of the Prince of Wales in 1925, all Royal Navy, with imaginative names like Wallflower and Verbena. So this is the arrival, of the beginning of the procession from the docks. So the Vanguard looming large on the horizon there, and the beginning of what was temporarily called King's Way. But this vast expanse of desolate foreshore, absolutely nothing on it. And you look at how the route has been arranged to make it look like it was the beginning of a triumphal route. And indeed, this was the gateway to Africa, which has been on and off the table of promotion for so many years. So that's the beginning of the procession. A word or two about the Vanguard. You should know me by now. I can't resist giving you the technical details of the vessel. HMS Vanguard was the biggest, fastest, and last battleship of the Royal Navy. She was ordered in 1941 and commissioned in 1946. Her displacement was 44,500 tons. She was nearly 250 meters in length. She had a speed of 30 knots and a range of 15,000 kilometers. Her ship's complement was 1,900, nearly 1,800 men. She had 22 guns and a sophisticated radar system. She was the best ship afloat, but the war was over. She was ideally suited for the propaganda purposes to literally show off show the flag and to convey King George VI and his family to South Africa in 1947, the first by a reigning monarch to South Africa. Anachronistically, this enormous vessel was technically called His Majesty's Yacht, because that's what conveyed the royal family. Just a few more words about the Vanguard. She was scheduled to carry out duties, the same duties for Australia and New Zealand in 1949, but by then the King was pretty ill, and the Vanguard joined the Mediterranean fleet and poignantly participated in the Queen's Coronation Fleet Review in 1953. This is present Queen Elizabeth II. So it had a very brief movie career in the last years of its life, featuring in Carry On Admiral and Sink the Bismarck. She was decommissioned and sold for scrap for £560,000 only in 1960. So it's rather a sad end for such a magnificent vessel.
She looks a bit dirty.
It's the quality of the picture, I'm afraid. I think it was all ship-shape and Bristol fashion, but the picture, I'm afraid, is not the best quality.
Never fired a shell in anger.
Never fired a shell in anger. Yeah, yeah. Although I'm quite sure they wanted to on some occasions. Right. Bearing in mind that His Majesty the King was on board, the two stars of the show, as we will come to see, were the Queen, here in her official portrait, which hangs in the South African Parliament, in her coronation robes. And interestingly, I don't know whether you'll be able to make it out, everybody went crazy about the botanical themes on the bridal train of Meghan Markle not so long ago. Queen Mother got there first. Apart from the shamrocks, thistles, leeks and roses, all the flowers of the national flowers of the Dominion countries were there as well. So there's a great whopping protea sort of between her ankles there. But Australian wattle, the New Zealand fern, I'm sure there's a maple leaf or two knocking around there. You can do a whole botanical expedition looking at this portrait. And the Princess Elizabeth, the heiress apparent, and in her informal gear on board the Vanguard. First up was this trip that we saw coming down Adley Street and coming into town. The first official engagement was at Government House, where Smuts was invested with the Order of Merit by the King. The Order of Merit is restricted to 24 living persons of merit. So this was indeed a high honour. There was a function at Government House shortly as part of that morning's proceedings, and it was attended by most people, except notably the nationalist MPs, and indeed it was boycotted by the leader of the opposition, D.F. Malan. So the first function was the state banquet that evening in Cape Town City Hall. Overdressed for the folding chairs and the trestle tables of the state banquet, as would have captioned this. Queen Elizabeth was wearing the Delhi Durbar tiara, which we'll come to in a moment, the Garter star and sash, and a ball gown that could house a small family. She set the bar high on this first occasion with a preview of the majestic style that she was to show during the next 3 months. The trestle tables and folding chairs of the City Hall hardly rose to the occasion, and nor did the stolid menu, which included bobotie, stuffed turkey, and an absolutely alarming ice cream in the South African Oranje Blanje Blauw, with a springbok head in biscuit on top of it. I mean, imagine being confronted with that at the end of a meal. Smuts and the King both gave fulsome speeches at the end of the meal, and which really kicked off the tour. Here we are with the Queen Mary. Sorry, she was wearing Queen Elizabeth was wearing the fringe tiara on this occasion at the City Hall. It's known as Queen Mary's fringe tiara, but in fact it goes all the way back in some form or another to Queen Charlotte, and was worn for the first time in South Africa to the state banquet at the City Hall on the 17th of February. Later that year, Princess Elizabeth wore it for her wedding. Famously, while she was being dressed, the tiara broke in two, to which the Queen Mother's blithe response was, "Never mind, we have other tiaras." Not many families who could say that in a crisis. And interestingly, the same tiara was worn by Princess Anne at her wedding a couple of years later, her first wedding. The next day was taken up with loyal addresses on the Grand Parade, the city and surrounding municipalities, each giving more obsequious and loquacious addresses than the last, and back on duty in the afternoon at a garden party at Westbrook, Queen Elizabeth was the star of attraction again, wafting about with her parasol and clouds of white ostrich feathers, a veritable swan amongst the well-upholstered Cape Town matrons in tweeds, furs, and sensible shoes. The war had only ended 15 months before, and what the public was used to was rather grainy images in black and white, obviously, of the King and Queen inspecting bomb sites. So to see them in the flesh, in colour, live, in these, the White Admiral's uniform and the cloud of ostrich feather was a real wow, you can imagine. The ball at the City Hall followed that evening, and this picture shows the exit from the ball after the occasion with the Queen and Mayor Abe Blumberg, followed by the King and Princess Elizabeth and Mayoress Miriam Goldberg and Princess Margaret bringing up the rear. On this occasion, same venue, different tiara, I call it. The Civic Ball at the City Hall on the 19th of February. The Oriental Circlet which was designed by Prince Albert for Queen Victoria in 1853. Made up of Indian rubies and opals that had been presented to her, and 2,600 diamonds which had been culled from the other bits and pieces that nobody no longer wore. So it was extensively reworked, but neither Queen Alexandra nor Queen Mary particularly liked it. Queen Elizabeth rather fancied it, and she wore it almost solidly for the next 60 years. It was one of her most favourite tiaras. It's hardly been seen since, so it's no doubt it'll be reworked again. Getting back to City Hall, one of the lasting legacies of the royal tour was the decision to substantially enlarge the City Hall's mayoral parlour to 48 times 21 feet by knocking 4 offices into one. It was accessed from the Darling Street entrance to the City Hall and the grand marble staircase, and it aspired to be, quote-unquote, worthy of the occasion and comparable to the prestige state or mayoral apartments anywhere in the world. It was panelled in stinkwood and furnished in custom-made furnished in custom-made Neisner stinkwood. The William and Mary style chairs, which you see dotted around here. There's the cursor. So those are not old William and Mary chairs, but made out of Neisner stinkwood, and some Bergère armchairs, which are still there, still in the original upholstery, and stacks of linen-fold ball and claw furniture, including a massive desk, which was 10 feet by 5 feet. And the manufacturers, in fact, queried it and said, "Have you got the measurements right? We've never manufactured a desk this large in our lives." All this furniture came in from the whopping price tag of £1,260. Just a few words about the room. The stinkwood panelling, I mean, this was made, talked yesterday about Mayor Verster trying to pull out all the stops and pass off Cape Town as an ancient capital city of the empire. And what this reworking of the mayoral office did was to really try and turn it to some kind of Guildhall experience. So it sits rather oddly in a 1905 Edwardian building, and it sort of pretends to be ancient Cape Dutch and God knows what else. But importantly, it includes crests along the wall here of all the former municipalities that went to make up Cape Town in 1913. Most of the paintings that are hanging in the chamber are still there. There's this marvellous Neville Lewis portrait of the Malay man. There's a rather dodgy Ormolu clock here, which is in extremely poor taste, poor condition rather. And this very large marquetry map of the peninsula, which was knocked off in 48 hours flat by a craftsman who undertook to do it. He didn't finish the job, but nobody's any the wiser because it still isn't finished. What it was supposed to get was a whole lot of Cape Dutch manners, which would illustrate this past of the peninsula. I should think there's little chance of highlighting Cape Manor houses in the City Hall at this turn of the 21st century. An important content of this room is a leather album with the silver crest of the city on the front, signed by the royal family. What's interesting here is that the king has signed himself George R.I., Rex Imperator, King Emperor. And this was practically the last time. This was in May, so there were not many more times when he would sign himself there, because India became independent on the 15th of August, so the Imperator bit was no longer relevant. Right, the next big event. Sorry, we'll come to the big event in a moment. Sorry, you're getting a sneak preview here. What's happened to my slides? How do I reverse this? I need to go back to the full screen. Okay, thank you. I've just got out of sequence here, I'm sorry. Okay, so the next big event was the opening of Parliament, which was obviously the prime reason for this whole visit to South Africa. Just before we leave the Abe Bloomberg parlour, as it subsequently became known, there's an interesting little press story that I found the other day. The royal blue carpet and curtains that were part of the £1,200 bill for the room themselves became a civic banquet long before the royal family arrived, and the press daily serialised attempts to evict a family of mice with arsenical corn. They left the night before the ball. They probably weren't up to the prospect of serving as liveried footmen. So there was this running battle. I mean, while Mayor Bloomberg was entertaining the press, so the mice were scurrying along the curtain rails, and the arsenical corn did it. Right, the main event, as I've said, was the opening of Parliament, not by the King of England, but by the King of South Africa on Friday, the 21st of February. It was significant for the rest of the Commonwealth that this was the first time that the sovereign had performed this constitutional function outside of Great Britain. And the King obliged with a few sentences in Afrikaans at the end of his speech, and that, with his public speaking difficulties, had the same mesmerizing effect as we've seen quite recently when the present Queen addressed that state banquet in Dublin with a few words of Gaelic. I mean, people were just sort of open-mouthed and gobsmacked, in much the same way that Princess Diana attempted a few phonetic sentences in Welsh at in Cardiff. So the opening of Parliament, this is a study for a much larger painting by Robert Broadley, with the King and Queen obviously enthroned in what was the Senate chamber. And there's a copy of the very tightly controlled access to Parliament on that day. This is the star of the show, apart from the King and the Queen, was the Delhi Durbar tiara that Queen Mary had lent to Queen Elizabeth for the occasion. British crown jewels are not allowed to leave the country. So when George and Mary were crowned Emperor and Empress of India in 1911, they had to knock up a couple of new crowns, and Queen Mary had a ball. As we know, she loved and adored jewellery. This was the original version here. We're showing the Cambridge emeralds, which was subsequently stripped out of it. The Cambridge emeralds, which she had hastily retrieved from her brother's mistress, and got them back into her clutches and control. So the tiara was reworked in 1922, and it incorporated the Cullinan 3 and 4, especially for this opening of the South African Parliament. So there was a bit of South Africa coming back. It's used. It was a very popular tiara with the Queen Mother, along with the other one that we spoke about. And these days, Camilla seems to have her hands on it and wears it at every occasion too. The opening of Parliament out of the way, that was the last function of the first part of the trip. And off they went to the royal train, which had been built especially for the occasion. It was drawn up in front of HMS Vanguard, and it left from Jaybirth on the 21st of April on a 3-month, 4,000-mile journey, which covered almost the whole of southern Africa. The map on the right there shows, that it takes in obviously the 4 provinces, as well as Swaziland and Basotho land, later Lesotho, and they flew up to northern and southern Rhodesia in Viscounts, and then caught the train back from Salisbury via Bulawayo through Bechuanaland and all the way back to Cape Town. So there are people here who know a lot more about this. Lee Kempthorne is our railway expert, and it's a fascinating story in its own. There's a combination of the best of South African and British engineering, and strange sort of style, because you had these gleaming white coaches that had people coming from great distances simply to see this train snaking through the countryside, and every time it stopped, out would come the bucket and mop brigade and make sure that it remained gleaming. It had a train which preceded it and a train which followed it, splitting all the functions of that were needed on board. Services from the King's hairdresser right down to who handled the telegraphs. And it was quite an event. It fully deserves a lecture on its own. Included, obviously, it's a very long journey. So here we have Princesses Margaret and Elizabeth taking control of the royal train temporarily. It's doubtful if the men on the footplate experienced the train's crockery. This always happens at summer school, is that you meet somebody who's got a gem of a tale to hand on to you. And I met a lady yesterday whose father had been responsible for the connection with Royal Dalton and who had manufactured all of this crockery for the royal train, as well as all of the linen, of the and tablecloths and everything else that they needed, and including a hastily sketched protea to make sure it had a South African flavour. And she tells me that they grew up with all the excess of this stuff. It was the only sheets and tablecloths that they knew at home for nearly 30 years after that. And she got rid of the loss of it quite recently on an auction because she's downsizing. Right, when they came back to Cape Town, there's a whole lot of business which is undertaken, and I'm very thankful to the Archives of Parliament for sourcing some of these images. Here we've got the Queen inspecting the business end of a shovel to plant trees at the Fernwood Parliamentary Club. The beautifully engraved stainless steel shovels are made by the Salt River Workshops, and the deed was carried out, and then the Queen set off to try her hand at some yikskay. Always book for a bit of entertainment. I was at Fernwood a couple of days ago. These are two of the trees, or two of the 4 trees that were planted by the royal family in an absolutely derelict Fernwood. It is quite disgraceful. The driveway is disintegrated almost completely. The grounds are filled with rubbish, and it's an absolute disgrace. So whoever you have contacts with, I think the agitation needs to start to get rid of it and give it, or send it to somebody who's going to look after it rather than have it in this state. So there were many occasions during this tour, the second half of the tour. I'm just trying to find a picture that I thought was here, but it seems to have gone walkabout. Okay. Part of this was obviously the Princess Elizabeth turning 21. And she turned 21 on the 21st of April. She immediately became heiress presumptive on a very, very crowded day in Cape Town, her famous radio broadcast dedicating herself to, quote unquote, our great imperial commonwealth, has become standard footage that we see with each new record-breaking anniversary of the Queen, cruising through 50 years, 60 years, 90th birthday, 92nd birthday, and the standard footage now includes this broadcast, which, sorry, it's the wrong picture. I should go back. No, not yet. The broadcast, which we now know was not filmed live from the gardens of Government House, but at the Victoria Falls Hotel, while they were up on the Rhodesian part of the tour. And this was simply because this was an extremely important occasion, an extremely important international broadcast, and they couldn't take any chances that it was actually going to work on the day from Cape Town. So it was all in the can before the event, and everybody thought that it looked like it came from Government House. So on the same day, the heiress apparent addressed a youth rally not far from here. I don't know if most of you remember where the old Rosebank Showgrounds was. So there is Princess Elizabeth between the mayor and mayoress, and chap here is Bishop Lavis. They must have put this up in a hurry. The South African flag is back to front. The next day was UCT's turn, and Vice-Chancellor Dr. Falconer and Chancellor General Smuts conferred an honorary doctorate of laws on the Queen, and that was a big day for UCT. I think it's important just to remember at this point that for Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret, this was the first time that they'd ever been out of Britain. And they had spent most of the war cooped up in Windsor Castle as a safety precaution, which was almost completely devoid of staff. All the important artworks had been taken off the walls. Furniture was covered in dust sheets. So a pretty miserable war until the Queen started learning how to change tyres. The trip abroad was their very first outing out of England. Seems strange, but that's what the record shows. So this was a holiday and an exciting time for them. So we're now drawing to the close of this visit. The evening of the Princess's 21st birthday was yet another ball at Government House, and one also at the City Hall. And on their way from a dinner at Westbrook given by the Governor-General, they stopped on Duval Drive and watched £1,500 worth of fireworks orchestrated by a specially imported London pyrotechnician. There's some good footage of that, which I unfortunately have not got. So we're coming to the end of that tour. The princes and princesses went on a flip over the peninsula in one of the Vikings of the King's Flight, and their parents paid a private visit to Vergelegen. The event which I think most people treasured afterwards, certainly in terms of pictures and memories, was the excursion up to Table Mountain by the King and Queen and the princesses. The royal family caught the cableway. General Smuts had walked up earlier at the age of 78. And he put the whole family through their paces on the top of the mountain. I don't know if any of you managed to see some of the movie-tone clips yesterday, and they're freely available on YouTube. But he's got them leaping about like clip springers on the top of Table Mountain. It's quite extraordinary. It's different from the rather formal photographs of them all lined up on Table Mountain. And then it was time to go. The City Hall was the occasion for a last state lunch on Thursday the 24th. Both the King and the Prime Minister spoke with some emotion, and unusually, the Queen made an unscheduled, charming speech of thanks to the women and children of South Africa. A mounted escort saw them down Adley Street, and the Duke's regiment were there as the last guard of honour. The assembled officials and their hard-working wives, including Jeremy's mother, gathered to bid their farewells at 3 o'clock. And their Majesties and their Royal Highnesses made their way up into the small platform high above the guns on HMS Vanguard. The artillery thundered out a salute across the bay. The crowds serenaded them with "Will ye no come back again?" "Auld Lang Syne," "Die Stem," the whole lot. Quite an amazing occasion. The royal family had worked incredibly hard on this tour. We know that the King felt guilty about sunning himself in South Africa through one of the worst and coldest winters on record in Britain, where his people were on very short rations after the war, while he was experiencing the bounties on the tables of South Africa. We now know that he was already quite seriously ill and in poor health, and he was often quite bad-tempered and particularly resentful of being managed in sanitized exposures to his subjects. Smuts choreographed the whole thing, a lot of it on his own cine camera, and his presence in every shot. And the only comparison I can think of is a bit like Jesse Jackson, who is there in every Mandela moment after 1994. It didn't do Smuts any good at all to be seen to be constantly in the group with the royal family, it did him some damage. So it was a problem, because his high ideals of holism and the defense of democracy simply had no purchase in his own country, and this highbrow feel-good did not carry the day. The enduring effects of the royal tour of South Africa did not deliver. The royal afterglow was no match for domestic pessimism, and growing racial tensions, and Smuts narrowly lost the 1948 election to the National Party, which temporarily parked the idea of a republic. George VI died as King of South Africa in 1952, and D.F. Malan attended the Queen's coronation in 1953 as a senior Commonwealth Prime Minister. But by 1962, the Governor-General was still in place, but by 1960, a referendum for the whole, for the white electorate, marginally chose a republic. But its racial policies, the anathema to the growing African and Asian Commonwealth, brought to an end the ties of the Crown for almost another 50 years. Just in ending, here's another image or two. After a decade of trying to track this thing down, we know that the Queen purchased an Irma Stern painting while she was here. Whether or not it was a painting that the Governor-General's wife had furnished the Queen's bedroom with it at Government House, I don't know. But she purchased a painting called Dahlias in Copper from Irma Stern in 1947 for a mere £63. Irma Stern immediately telegraphed all her friends that the Queen had bought a painting, But on the 27th of August, Her Majesty's Treasurer had to write and say, please cash the cheque. Irma had been wandering around showing everybody the cheque. This is a picture not dissimilar to the one which was bought by the Queen. The one that was bought by her was in sort of more autumnal colours and in a copper container. But this one, just to give you an idea of that investment of £63, only last year fetched 8 million rand on a Sotheby's auction. And of course 8 million rand is about £3.50, but there it is. So we're hot on the trail of getting an image of the actual Irma Stern in the Royal Collection, and we hope that will eventually be something that might even return to South Africa. Right, so things go absolutely doggo for another number of years until a visit by the Queen, a return visit to South Africa by the Queen as the head of the Commonwealth for the Heads of Commonwealth conference, which was held in South Africa in 1995. I must apologise for a very poor stock of photographs that I managed to get at the last moment here, but I think that they adequately convey the importance. Magnificent shot of HMY, Her Majesty's yacht, Britannia, in Table Mountain with that incomparable background. And what's important to note that this was the last official outing of the Royal Yacht Britannia. It was shortly after, and this was the last sort of state function on which it was used. And very shortly after that, the Labour government decided to scrap the Royal Yacht. And you've all seen endless footage of that teary occasion. The Queen inspecting her party on the quayside. And what's absolutely amazing here is, if you recall the first lecture, 1860, this is not far from where Prince Alfred had started the breakwater. In 1860, this is 1995. It closes the circle. There's another picture here. Again, I apologize for the paucity of pictures. When you cast your mind back to the pictures of the bunting for Africa for all the other royal tours, this is what Cape Town came up with in 1995. A couple of poles, and not much. A crowd assembled outside the City Hall when the Queen visited the City Hall, I think, just to check whether it was still there. But there are some charming shots that I've seen of her sort of peering in and sort of saying, yes, I sort of remember this. But of course, the City Hall had been tarted up on those occasions, on that occasion of the state banquet and the civic ball. It was probably in not a great condition, but they did their best to try and dress the place. Unfortunately, we've still got those rather ghastly wrought iron chandeliers, but somebody had a brainwave and covered them in ostrich feathers. And I have actually seen pictures of that, but not great for anybody who had hay fever. The other important occasion was this one with the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh attesting the Human Rights Day service at St George's Cathedral with the Dean, Colin Jones, otherwise known as Joan Collins by his own admission, receiving them. And this was quite, I remember the television footage of this occasion where people were going wild in the streets and people who were interviewed, and are you excited to see the Queen? Is that who you've come to see? No, we've come to see Madiba. So, this whole thing is turned on its head when you look at the spectrum of the first royal visit and this last one. We're unlikely to get another royal visit, but there it is. What I've got, we've got the movie bit here. I have managed to source a very short movie of the royal visit in 1995.
And I hope the time is not too far distant.
Thank you.
When I can visit you again. That wish has never deserted me through a half-century, during which you have seen turmoil and tragedy. Now, though...
It's not showing there. Sorry, you just got the sound, not the movie. Too much sound. It needs to be a little low. There you go.
Everywhere in the Union. And I hope the time is not too far distant when I can visit you again. That wish has never deserted me through a half-century, during which you have seen turmoil and tragedy. Now, though, you have become one nation whose spirit of reconciliation is a shining example to the world. And I have come back to see for myself what is little short of a miracle.
As she flew to South Africa, represented a wistful reference to her first visit here 48 years ago. Then, a 20-year-old princess, she played deck games with midshipmen aboard the battleship Vanguard, as the entire royal family sailed south for an extended tour. But the light-hearted skylarking was soon to be replaced by the young princess's introduction to the pomp of a state visit, as the battleship steamed into Cape Town harbour. King George VI, then also the monarch of South Africa, had come to thank the country for its support during World War II. But the expressions of loyalty were deceptive. South Africa was about to become the lost dominion. The Afrikaners who'd opposed helping Britain in the war just stayed away. The following year, the Afrikaner-led National Party won the election and set the country on a path to apartheid and international isolation. This time, the Queen was again to make a seaborne approach to Cape Town by transferring to Britannia. She sailed in past Robben Island, the notorious prison where Nelson Mandela spent much of his 27 years in jail before emerging to lead his country to a new future. From both sea and shore, 21-gun salutes were fired as the royal yacht berthed alongside the same jetty from which political prisoners had been ferried out to serve their sentences at Robben Island. Mr. Mandela, who became president in the first democratic elections last April, arrived to greet her. The visit comes at a time of hope and a time of testing. a test of the policies of his new government, and a test of her new relationship with South Africa as head of the Commonwealth. South Africa broke its links with both Crown and Commonwealth in 1961. Now they're being restored, but it's a delicate task. Britain's history as a colonial power must be acknowledged, but that can't be the basis for a new relationship with a new country. Other old colonies have had time to evolve their relations with Britain, but here, after the blank years of apartheid, they have to be created anew. As part of that, the South African government has laid out a royal programme of quite remarkable candour. We're going to be following the Queen as she's shown the problems facing the people. The poverty, the unemployment, the desperation that other governments would choose to hide. The old colonial links, dating back to the days when South Africa was a pillar of imperial power. And the promise of a country whose riches and beauty offer it the chance of an outstanding future. Cape Town, beneath Table Mountain, has always been the symbol of South Africa, but it's the symbol of European domination. It was here that the white settlers first arrived. It was from here that the colonial government ran the country. Here too that the nationalists passed the detested apartheid laws. Yet it remains the legislative capital of the country, a symbol now that Nelson Mandela's government is set on a path of continuity and reconciliation. Visit got off to a sparkling start as the President walked the Queen through lines of schoolchildren to the official ceremonies. His own personal warmth fed through into the welcome. It was as though the long rift in relations had been a family quarrel to be made up with an excess of emotion. Formally, there was an exchange of honours. For the Queen, South Africa's highest honour, the Order of Good Hope. For the President, the Order of Merit, held by only one other foreigner, Mother Teresa of Calcutta. Then the Queen was invited to address the country's new multiracial parliament, the symbol of how revolutionary change had been achieved without the bloodbath so widely predicted.
It was a fitting tribute to you, President Mandela, and to Deputy President de Klerk, when you were both in 1993 awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. It was a recognition of the spirit which inspired the bringing of peace and freedom to South Africa. The transformation wrought here, culminating in the elections last year, has set the country on a democratic course from which there can be no turning back.
But they're farming in line with nature.
Afterwards, chatting to MPs, she showed that even with all her experience, she could still feel the strain of a big occasion.
It's a very large house now, isn't it?
490 members.
Yeah, we're all quite close. Makes it quite alarming when one's addressing a house so close like that.
You did well.
No, you did well.
Oh, thank you.
It set an example for politicians to be short and make the point clearly, not long-winded like we politicians tend to do.
Or us lawyers, because we get paid. You've got to make the difference between when you don't get paid and when you get paid.
It's more orderly, and perhaps it's good that in the transition at least we have more orderly debates.